I just received some very, very pressing statistics about the big banks and Wall Street and just how much they have screwed our economy and how they will screw our economy again very soon. Now, I described all of the things that led to the recession with the financial system in an earlier video. However, what I didn't know at the time I made it was just the extent of how much they gambled and how much greed they showed. I never knew until now just the extent of it, but it's something that every person across the nation should know. So let's get started. Now, the financial system was pretty functional throughout the 1940s on through the 70s, and that also corresponded with a fantastic time for this country because we took care of our people. However, as soon as Ronald Reagan and the conservatives took over in the 80s, we saw the rise of Reaganomics and the trickle-down theory, how if the rich have all the money, if we give it to them, somehow, some way, everybody else will get a piece of the pie, right? Yeah, at the same time, they loosened the rules for the big banks, and because of it, the banks grew greedier and more large and beastly by the minute. It all came back to haunt us in the 2000s when homes were selling like hotcakes, and the banks were letting just about anybody buy a house. It didn't matter if you were a drunk off the street or an unemployed janitor, anybody could buy a house. The problem was that these people must pay all that money back on that house with extra to the bank, right? The mortgage. Well, if home prices are higher than ever and you're selling these houses to just about anybody, doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, that's a serious problem because most of these people cannot pay back on this house. But on top of that, the banks would sell the money that they received from these people on the mortgages in bundles with hundreds of these toxic mortgages in little packages of crap. And they would sell these bundles of mortgages to other banks who would sell them to investors and pension funds and other financial institutions. It was all over the place. Even though they knew these bundles would eventually be worth absolutely nothing because the people cannot pay back on these houses and the money from the bundle will be worthless. But besides the fact that they knew that these mortgages were absolute crap, they would pay off rating agencies that's supposed to give ratings on these bundles of mortgages. And instead of them receiving the crap rating it should receive because the people cannot pay back the mortgage, instead they would receive the top of the top ratings. It was a fraud, massive fraud. So investors would receive these bundles of toxic mortgages thinking, heck, it's got a AAA rating, why not buy it? I'm getting my money back. Little did they know, these bundles of mortgages were from people who simply couldn't pay back on those houses, so the money would very soon be absolutely worthless. But I'm not nearly done. The banks would then bet on those bundles of toxic mortgages, so there was 100 times the money of the mortgages tied up in the entire thing. And the big banks would bet against the mortgages, which just goes to prove that they knew that the mortgages were crap. So when the mortgages failed miserably, they would make money. It was an entire grand scheme. Hopefully I'm making sense because this is where it gets interesting. These banks would also bet on a variety of other things, from the price of oil to the economy to even the weather. By 2007, the year when the financial crisis began, all the banks together had $500 trillion in money tied up in bets. For comparison, that is 6 times the size of the global economy. The problem was that all of these banks had no money to back those bets up. So if they screwed up on one, they could pay it back. Yeah, the banks could not do that because they had no money to back it up. Therefore, once just a few of their bets went bad, they collapsed because they had no money to pay those bets back. The mortgage nonsense was the few bets gone bad for the banks. It was the disturbance in the system that it needed for the entire thing to collapse, and therefore the entire economy nearly collapsed because of it. Now, we would expect the government to be outraged by all of this greed shown by the banks. I mean, they nearly destroyed the economy. The banks, because of so much money inside of the system, so much lobbying, and so much power that they have over our government, they received a little slap on the wrist. And the government put little love tap rules in for the banks. And the banks are doing exactly what we'd expect them to do. take advantage. Since the beginning of the crisis, when the banks had $500 trillion tied up in these bets, that number has ballooned to $700 trillion in bets. And the few bad bets we just discussed could possibly be occurring at this moment, with the price of oil dropping to such low levels and with so many bets tied up in it. I'm seriously worried about the fate of this economy in 2015 and beyond. The middle class is collapsing, and the global economy is rather weak. We simply can't handle another financial system mishap, but we're more exposed than ever. As I pointed out with the $700 trillion in bets for the financial system, the top 5 banks in this country, with Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and Morgan Stanley, they're in serious trouble. Chase has total assets of about $2.5 trillion, but its total exposure to bets is more than $67 trillion. Citibank has total assets of about $1.9 trillion, but its total exposure to bets is nearly $60 trillion. Goldman Sachs has total assets of about less than $1 trillion, but total exposure to derivatives is more than $54 trillion. Bank of America has total assets of a bit more than $2.1 trillion, but its total exposure to bets is more than $54 trillion. And Morgan Stanley has total assets of about $800 billion, but its total exposure to bets is more than $44 trillion. Now, why does this affect you? Because our economy is more tied up than ever with these banks that are about to absolutely collapse. We're screwed. People, we're screwed. At this point, the 5 largest banks in this country account for 42% of all loans in the United States of America, and the 6 largest banks control 67% of all banking assets. If one of those banks collapse with a few bad bets, which is very likely to occur, our financial system will collapse, and our economy will collapse. The economy is weak, and the global economy is even weaker. The stress would destroy the economy very, very quickly. This could be a crisis on a massive proportion, worse than the Great Depression, when a quarter of people in this country became jobless, and the economy dropped half its value. And you know what? You have Wall Street to thank for this incoming crisis.